She rolled her eyes and turned her back on the quiet man in seat 14A, unaware that the same hands she'd just dismissed had gripped the fate of a nation. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight soared above the Mediterranean, heading south toward West Africa. Among the hum of conversations and the rustling of papers, seat 14A remained still, occupied by a man dressed simply in a dark jacket and plain trousers, eyes fixed on the clouds outside. When the flight attendant reached his row, her smile faltered as she glanced at his ticket. With a slightly irritated tone, she asked, "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" He nodded politely, his voice low and calm. "Yes, this is mine." She gave a tight, dismissive smile and moved on, offering champagne and courtesy to others while ignoring him for the rest of the service. What she didn't know, what no one around him knew, was that this soft-spoken traveler was Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the President of Burkina Faso, a revolutionary leader hailed across Africa for his fierce independence and unshakable resolve. He had boarded quietly, without entourage or ego, choosing to travel among his people. Power did not weigh on his shoulders like gold. It lived in his character. And while she served coffee to a CEO and bowed to a diplomat, she overlooked the only man on board who had moved an entire continent with his words. As the plane descended toward Ouagadougou, airport security subtly mobilized, and journalists gathered. The flight attendant's confusion turned to awe as she watched the quiet man escorted off the plane by a line of saluting soldiers. Her face flushed as the realization sank in. In her haste to serve status, she had ignored substance. But the president never looked back, only offering a nod, not of arrogance, but of forgiveness. She stood frozen at the aircraft's door, watching the convoy of black SUVs and soldiers gather on the tarmac. Cameras flashed in the distance. The passenger she had dismissed hours ago walked calmly into the spotlight, his posture straight, face unreadable, as if royalty had emerged from anonymity. Her heart pounded. Whispers spread through the crew like wildfire. That was the president? The president of Burkina Faso? She replayed every moment, her cold tone, her condescension, her choice to overlook a man because his appearance didn't scream wealth or power. Shame settled into her stomach like a stone. Later, in the airport terminal, as passengers disembarked and the media's buzz died down, she lingered by the window, still in uniform, eyes locked on the now empty runway. Then, unexpectedly, she heard a voice behind her. "You did your job!" She turned. It was him, still without bodyguards, without fanfare. Only his presence had changed. It now radiated something she hadn't noticed before. Quiet authority, wrapped in humility. I didn't know who you were," she stammered. "You didn't need to," he replied gently. "But you could have known what I was. A human being." His words weren't cruel, they were kind, but they cut deeper than anger ever could. She blinked away tears, unable to respond. "I don't travel with titles," he added, "because titles change how people behave. I prefer the truth with that." He offered a small smile and walked away, leaving her not humiliated but awakened. In that moment, the uniform she wore felt heavier, not with guilt, but with the burden of how easily respect can be filtered through class, color, or clothing. For the first time, she realized the real weight of power wasn't in crowns or sashes. It was in how you made others feel when they had none. Days passed, but the moment stayed with her like a shadow. Back in her apartment in Paris, Mia, the flight attendant with the quick smile and quicker judgments, couldn't stop thinking about the man in seat 14A. Her colleagues had turned the story into gossip. Can you believe that was a president? Good thing he didn't complain. But for Mia, it was no longer about embarrassment. It was about reflection. She began reading about him, not the tabloid versions, but his speeches, his beliefs. She learned how Captain Ibrahim Traoré had led a quiet revolution in Burkina Faso, not for power, but to return dignity to his people. He spoke against foreign exploitation, stood with the oppressed, and refused luxuries even as a head of state. He was not just powerful, he was principled. And Mia had treated him like someone invisible. Her world view began to shift. She noticed how often people like him, quiet, modest, black, African, were treated as less, not just on flights. In cafes, in offices, in government halls, even in the skies, the so-called equal space, the hierarchy never disappeared. It was stitched into every interaction. One afternoon she penned a letter, not to apologize, he had already shown her grace, but to thank him. "You changed the way I see people," she wrote. "You showed me that real power doesn't ask to be seen. It simply is." She began volunteering at a local community center helping migrants. She changed how she trained new crew members, emphasizing human dignity over customer profiles. Her flight announcements became warmer. Her eyes searched beyond appearance. Never saw President Traoré again, but every time she passed seat 14A on any plane in any country, she whispered to herself, "Don't miss the story behind the silence." The convoy moved swiftly through the dusty streets of Ouagadougou. The president sat in silence in the back seat, window slightly open, letting the dry wind graze his face. Around him, ministers spoke in hushed tones about security reports and economic plans. But Traoré wasn't listening. His mind was on a flight and a face. He remembered her clearly, the flight attendant who looked past him. Not out of malice, but out of something deeper. The conditioning that taught the world to equate power with polish, worth with wealth, respect with recognition. He didn't blame her. Not really. He had grown used to being unseen outside his own land. In Europe, in conferences, in airports, he'd watched heads turn toward his French counterparts, while his own presence drew only curious glances or indifference. It was the price of carrying power in skin the world had learned to overlook. But that flight had been different. Not because of the disrespect. He had long stopped reacting to that. What stayed with him was the look in her eyes when she realized. Not just who he was, but what she'd missed. He'd seen the shift, the flicker of awakening, the crack in the armor of assumption. And that, to him, was a greater victory than applause. Leadership, he had come to understand, wasn't just about speeches and strategies. It was about the small revolutions, the unseen ones, the ones that happened in hearts. He hoped she would carry that discomfort like a seed, letting it grow into awareness, into empathy, into change. As his convoy turned toward the presidential compound, a child waved from the roadside. He waved back, smiling. "This is why I stay. Humble," he thought. "So no one ever fears to greet me. So I can see the world not from above, but among it." And somewhere, across the continent, a flight attendant was changing how she moved through the sky. Because of a silent man in seat 14A. Weeks later, the president stood at the edge of a village outside Ouagadougou, surrounded by elders, farmers, and barefoot children. He had come not to give a speech, but to listen. A woman spoke of water shortages. A young man pleaded for school supplies. A child clutched his mother's hand, staring up at Traoré with wide, curious eyes. Traoré knelt beside him and asked, "What do you dream of?" The boy hesitated. "To fly a plane, like the ones above the clouds." The president smiled gently. "Then aim higher than the clouds. Just remember who's below them." Meanwhile, across the sea, Mia walked through a different kind of terminal, not of flights, but of purpose. She had left her airline job a few weeks earlier, not out of guilt, but growth. The sky had taught her many things, but the man in 14A had taught her the most important: to see. She had joined a humanitarian program that brought education to displaced children from Africa and the Middle East. She no longer served coffee at 30,000 feet. She now served futures at ground level. Her past self felt like a stranger, the one who judged passports by covers and passengers by clothes, and yet she often found herself whispering one name in private: Ibrahim. Not out of regret, but reverence. His quiet strength had become her compass. In Burkina Faso, a journalist once asked Traore, "Why do you travel without guards, without grandeur?" He replied, "Because when you walk among people as one of them, you hear what power cannot. And sometimes you meet someone who isn't ready to see you, but one day they will. And when they do, the world changes, even just a little." And far away, in a school filled with children who once had no home, a former flight attendant looked up at the sky, not for status or glory, but for the reminder that even the highest flights begin from humble ground. It was a warm morning in Ouagadougou when a sealed envelope arrived at the presidential palace. No stamps, no embassy mark, just a handwritten name: President Ibrahim Traoré. His assistant brought it to him quietly. He opened it with curiosity, expecting perhaps a local request or a policy concern. But inside was a short letter, written in careful cursive on plain white paper. It read, "Dear Mr. President, you may not remember me, or perhaps you remember everyone. I was the flight attendant on the journey where I failed to see who you were, not just in title, but in humanity. You said to me, you didn't need to know who I was, but you could have known what I was: a human being. Those words followed me across continents, into silence, into change. I left the skies months ago. I now teach refugee children how to read, how to dream, and how to speak with dignity. The same dignity I once denied you. You taught me that true leadership doesn't shout. It whispers and waits. Thank you for showing me who I could be by never punishing who I was." With humility and deep respect, Mia Laurent, he read it twice. Then again. Outside his window, a line of citizens waited: farmers, nurses, teachers, all seeking time with the man they now trusted. But for a moment, Ibrahim sat still, eyes on the letter, heart wrapped in quiet gratitude. He took out a piece of paper and wrote back with a rare smile, "Dear Mia, the skies lose many, but the ground gains few. I'm glad the world found you. Never regret the moment we met. It was not your mistake. It was your awakening. What you do now echoes farther than any flight ever could. Thank you for seeing the unseen, including yourself." Warmly, Ibrahim, and so, no podium, no broadcast, no press release, just two people changed forever by a moment that began not with power, but with silence. Sometimes the greatest revolutions begin at 30,000 feet. In a refugee camp outside Timbuktu, a young girl named Amina held her first book. She was 9, barefoot, and had never stepped into a school. Until one day, a traveling education worker sat beside her with a soft smile and said, "This is yours now." That woman was Mia. She taught not only language and math, but respect, confidence, and dreams. Amina would ask questions about planes. One day she said, "Why did you stop flying?" Mia knelt beside her and replied, "Because someone once showed me the ground is where change begins." Amina paused. "Was it your father?" Mia laughed gently. "No, a stranger, but he saw me when I couldn't see myself." Later that night, Amina wrote in her notebook, "When I grow up, I want to fly, but first I want to learn how to land." In Burkina Faso, President Traoré prepared for a televised address. His advisors fussed over talking points, trade deals, and numbers, but he crossed them out. Instead, he began, "Power is not in how loud you speak. It's in who listens when you are silent." He spoke not of politics that day, but of dignity. He told the story of a flight, a mistake, and a letter that changed him more than strategy ever did. The speech was aired across Africa. It wasn't the words that shook the continent. It was the tone, humility wrapped in strength. Young leaders began quoting him. Teachers shared the flight story with students. Activists replayed the address. A new phrase began to spread on social media. Who's in your row 14? It became a global metaphor, a reminder to notice the invisible, to question our assumptions, to respect the quiet among us. 10 years later, Ibrahim Traoré retired, not in scandal, not in defeat, but by choice. He left office with no private jet, no mansion, no statue. Just a library built in his name in the village where he was born, and a plaque inside that read, "Let them remember not the power I held, but the people I served." In Paris, a young woman named Amina stood at a conference podium, now a pilot, now a scholar. She wore a simple pendant around her neck, a miniature seat tag, 14A. She told the story of a president she never met, but who had inspired the woman who taught her to read, and in the audience sat an older woman, silent and proud. Mia. Their eyes met. No words were needed. Sometimes legacy is not a building, a law, or a monument. Sometimes it is a ripple and a seat on a plane.